This episode was made in collaboration with Our Changing Climate. Why don't you go watch his video after this one, huh? He's a good guy. Why would you not watch his video? Forget it, you disgust me. Anyway, on February 28th, 2022, the IPCC released its latest report on the state of climate change and its predictions for the future. In it, you'll find the usual stuff you find in an IPCC report. We have less time than we thought, the consequences of inaction will be horrible, and the snowballing effect of climate change will continue to pull more and more people into increasingly dire situations. It's not great news, and we've gotten to a point where, sadly, it hardly makes headlines. Meanwhile, in some countries, far-right politicians talking about the environment look like this. But in other countries, they look like this. That's really weird. For a political camp united on every front, on economics, on immigration, on authority, it's strange to see that there's a seemingly large divide on such an important topic. The idea that one side of the far right includes environmental action in its political program, when the other flatly rejects the idea that such a thing even exists, is a weird feature of 21st century politics that doesn't seem to make sense. These guys are best buddies. They never fight on anything. Also, isn't environmentalism a left-wing thing? Why aren't they on the same page all of a sudden? The truth is, they are. The pro-fossil fuel far right and the pro-environment far right are one and the same, colored differently in traditional brown or trendy green in a desperate bid to respond to their society's vision of what a reactionary politics should look like in the 2020s. But make no mistake, whether it's under a coat of green varnish or not, the core ideological philosophy is the same. And sadly for the rest of us, it isn't contained to the horrible far-right extremists that make headline after headline. Their politics have bled over towards the center without much difficulty. How so? Well, we'll get to all that and more in this video. Don't worry. For both the climate skeptic and the quote-unquote green far-right, the rationale is the same, and the consequences are nearly identical. Terrifying, authoritarian, ethno-nationalist, white supremacist politics. The kind to which the political center has no good response. So strap in. In this episode, we're going to dig a little deeper into the supposed contradiction between fossil fascism and eco-fascism, and how both of them come to influence the center's response to climate change. Let's start with the first half, fossil fascism. Today, fossil fascism looks like this.
Folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border, do not come.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
This land is where the Dakota Access Pipeline is being built.
It's scary because to shoot rubber bullets at these people that are completely unarmed when they took an oath to protect them.
Fossil fascism. It is a politics based on exclusion, segregation, and repression. It's horrific and bound to fail. It bursts the constraints of liberal Western hypocrisy. But what makes this sort of stuff fascism? What does it have to do with the environment? And where does this movement even come from? To answer all that, we need to jump back a couple years. And thanks to this book by Andreas Malm, I'm gonna breeze right through this historical recap. Okay, so it's 1988. Everyday people are throwing toothpicks on the ground in a lame attempt to make a joke. The US just went through one of its hottest summers yet, and blasting on American TVs all across the country are images of burning forests and sweaty white people. The words greenhouse effect are still pretty controversial, but creeping into American vocabulary. Americans are starting to wonder, could this be global warming? So a guy goes to the Senate, and he says, yeah, which, while you might think is a good thing, starts freaking out fossil capitalists. That is, capitalist enterprises in the business of extracting and selling fossil fuels. Hanson's testimonial, like a canary in a very lucrative coal mine, was a wake-up call for fossil capital, suddenly threatened by public recognition of the greenhouse effect and a direct, visible line between the scientific community and institutions of power. Unsurprisingly then, this attention to climate change triggered a wave of fossil fuel money investments into think tanks and advertisements that would position climate change as a mere theory, fighting upstream against the emerging scientific consensus. Or alternatively, would postulate that carbon dioxide was actually good, that we need more of it, that carbon emissions are life itself. To do that effectively, fossil capital built a marketing strategy around carbon's role in a plant's life cycle. But it also, much more insidiously, exploited the white supremacist bedrock of American society in its propaganda. It associated CO2 with life itself, but not all life. White life and white civilization specifically. This culminated in a 2006 ad by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, in which a sharp distinction is made between freedom, meaning walking around New York City, blowing bubbles, and running on a beach, which we are told is all thanks to fossil fuels, and backbreaking labor, symbolized by the ad's only black actor, placed in a vaguely rural African context with a thatched hut in the background.
It's called carbon dioxide, CO2. The fuels that produce CO2 have freed us from a world of backbreaking labor. Now some politicians want to label carbon dioxide a pollutant. Imagine if they succeed. What would our lives be like then?
Civilized freedom on one side, uncivilized labor on the other. The message of the ad is clear. Are you going to believe the climate scientists who want us to go back to being savages, or will you choose freedom and civilization? This ad was intended to conjure up specific images in the mind of its audience, associating fossil fuel consumption with the birth of white civilization itself. The point is that thanks in part to these advertising efforts, civilization itself was presented as nothing more than a product of a Eurocentric consumption of fossil fuels, an attachment to growth forever and always, supplied by a constant flow of cheap energy, be it trapped in human bodies or underground. To reject fossil fuels, then, was to reject civility, modernity, to plunge prosperous societies back into a more laborious and backwards age, only fit for people who don't look like you, the typical white American audience member. If that sounds like a lot to get from a single ad, it's because it would be if that's what I was actually arguing. This, of course, wasn't the product of a single 60-second ad spot. Many ads and much communication like this existed. And crucially, this narrative wasn't created out of thin air. The ad was just a bold yet subtle admission of one of the West's founding myths, that the Industrial Revolution and slavery, pulling black coal from the earth and black people from Africa, built the civilization we have today. Why would we give that up? Why should we? At least that's the anxiety fossil capital was hoping to trigger in the American populace, and it really worked. Over time, thanks to the conscious efforts of fossil capital, more and more of the factors associated with climate change came to be looked at through this lens. This specific story of progress coming from fossil consumption. The Heartland Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and dozens more all had the mission of denying climate change, proposing weak mitigation strategies, but most crucially, associating fossil fuels with a specific American way of life. In other words, this narrative that fossil fuels literally built the modern world, the White West, continued to evolve over time, adapting and setting the tone for every conversation the climate denialist far right wanted to push through. The first test came during the wars over oil in the Middle East. The race to secure Western hands on large beds of fossil fuels became deeply entangled with values that would make acquiring those fossil fuels, and the war in general, appealing to a Western audience. It became about bringing democracy to the Middle East, or protecting our democracy from the terrorists that threaten our way of life. We're not taking that oil out of greed, it's for the greater good.
That's part of what makes us special as Americans. Unlike the old empires, we don't make these sacrifices for territory or for resources. We do it because it's right.
Then, later, when the inevitable outcome of these wars was large-scale migration, there too the role of fossil fuel greed was hidden behind fear-mongering of the quote, uncivilized other. Immigrants, specifically Muslim immigrants, were portrayed as too eager to come over to white countries, and once again threaten our way of life. We still feel the echoes of that mentality today as climate change creates more displacement. Say, isn't there a great video covering that topic extensively? Anyway, the same slogans around national unity or white culture are shouted by the far right to this day to make immigration as brutal, deadly, and unwelcoming a process as possible, while sanctifying white society and its reliance on fossil fuels. The most perverse part of this whole thing is that the reality of fossil fuel history, a tool that demanded and could be used to exert tremendous force against the global south, was hidden from the Western public behind the exact opposite narrative, presenting fossil fuel use and civilized democracy as one and the same. And here we get to the point where you're like, whoa, which you're welcome and thank you. But then you're like, what about Le Pen? What about those far-right leaders who don't deny climate change? Who have big publicity stunts where they show off how green they are? Surely they can't subscribe to the same philosophy. Well, the good thing for them is that the same narrative that underpinned their support for fossil fuels, ethno-nationalism, is incredibly easy to retool for a pseudo-environmentalism based on white supremacy. Eco-fascism works a little differently. If this isn't your first time hearing the term, you might have heard it from reports on the Christchurch or El Paso shooters, both of whom subscribed to the ideology. An ideology which frames environmentalism through a few key narratives: authoritarianism, anti-immigration, and population control along eugenic or genocidal terms. Have I mentioned YouTube's automatic demonetization system, or maybe my Patreon? Anyway, eco-fascism works by appealing to the same narratives as fossil fascism, the greatness of Western society to be protected at all costs against the invasion of the uncivilized other. In this narrative, eco-fascists take stock of some of the incredible toll on human lives that runaway climate change will have, pushing people away from their homes, their communities, and forcing many of them to migrate towards parts of the world where these effects are less dramatic. Rather than acknowledge the historical role that Western states and a capitalist economy have in this story of reckless pollution or treating these people like the human beings they are, eco-fascism retreats behind walls and austere individualism. It gravitates to the idiotic, Malthusian fears of overpopulation and resource depletion, pinning the blame on the masses in faraway lands, coming to take everything from them, and not on the industries they benefit from and wish to keep to themselves. As if a family in the global south had anything to do with climate change when a handful of companies produce and profit off of emissions on a scale difficult to even understand. Eco-fascism conjures up narratives it inherited from Nazism, romanticizing nationalism along the lines of blood and soil rhetoric so that it can pretend that the solution to climate change is to localize without any consideration for the rest of the world. The history of environmentalism is rife with figures thinking in exactly these terms, and greenwashing ethno-nationalism. Crucially, eco-fascism sees the response to climate change being chiefly population control, specifically the white Western population controlling the population of other countries, directly or indirectly, and always from behind strong borders it frames as protecting its national ecosystem. It assumes the fight against climate change is best achieved through the authoritarian domination of one society over another, ignoring entirely that that balance of power is precisely what got us to this point and is stopping us from making meaningful progress. Like fossil fascism then, eco-fascism is fundamentally dependent on the idea that some people are destined and uniquely capable of managing the earth and its resources, while others do nothing but pose a threat and don't do justice to the land they occupy. It's dependent on a deeply racist conception of racial hierarchy with the arbitrary white race at the top. This, whether it's used by an eco-fascist or a fossil fascist, is just as easily a justification of rigid borders to the outside and intransigent localism, two key features of modern fascism. I understand that the first reaction some of you might have to this kind of analysis is to assume that this divergence means one side or the other is lying about its convictions when it comes to climate change, that this is all manipulation. But the truth is that it doesn't matter. Far-right leaders may genuinely believe in climate change or denialism, or not. That's not the point. The point is that the topic of climate change is just a new way for fascists to introduce the terms of fascism into the public discourse, to talk about immigration when you want to talk about renewables. Whether they sincerely believe in climate change or not is unimportant because, in either case, they are only capable of thinking about climate change in the terms of immigration and ethno-nationalism. Whether they land on fossil fascism or eco-fascism, they reach the same conclusion. Unfortunately for the rest of us, neoliberalism is particularly vulnerable to this kind of fascist dialogue. It has absorbed the foundational premises of fossil and eco-fascism by default. In its quest to constantly limit the role of government to tooth-and-nail support for international capital and strong national borders, neoliberalism concedes all its power to the winners of fossil fuel history and to the narratives embraced by fascists of all stripes. Neoliberalism thus uniquely fails in its attempts to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and to counter the narratives embraced by the far right. It cannot respond to the crisis of climate change with solidarity with the global south, because it is unwilling to extend its hand meaningfully. It can only think in terms of markets. It cannot upend the centuries of exploitation and extraction so profitable to its industries, nor can it justify the transfer of wealth necessary to pay reparations to and prepare the global south for alternative energy production and the likely effects of climate change. Nor can it open its borders to the climate refugees its relentless obsession with carbon consumption has caused. It simply wouldn't be profitable. It would require a different conception of government. It wouldn't fit in with the rest of the neoliberal doctrine of developed states setting the rules of the game and everyone else following along. Even when neoliberal states profess their belief in climate change, and even when they want to seek international solutions, their deals, like the Kyoto Accords for example, are always based on individualizing the response at the national level and making sure that the nations on top, the global north, keep their way of life and the south keeps theirs. It's trying to make change without touching the power relations of global geopolitics. This means ignoring the climate debt that countries like the US have racked up, shaming the global south when it tries to catch up without, of course, providing the funds for a meaningful alternative and locking down borders to keep everybody out. It means keeping the movement of industries and markets free, to the point of creating new markets for carbon entirely, but the movement of people heavily restricted. The neoliberalism of the 21st century, for all its appeals for an international solution to climate change, is too attached to its grip on the global south to ever meaningfully progress on that front. And in the process, it gives credibility and power to the world built by the far right. We need a politics of repair and collective interest. We need vested interest out of the conversation, fossil capital out of the way, and genuine solidarity across our borders, which are nothing but meaningless lines in the ground for polluted air to blow across. We need eco-socialism today, or we will face the barbarism of ecological collapse unarmed. This episode was made in collaboration with Our Changing Climate. If you're not familiar with the channel, I highly recommend you check out their companion video about climate change and borders. Climate change is the existential crisis of our time, and building socialism and addressing the challenge of climate change go hand in hand. Our Changing Climate is one of my favorite channels on YouTube, so definitely go check out their work.